We have now come to the second part of the inauguration ceremony, in which we will get the pleasure to listen to two keynote speakers. The first will be Professor Sara Dolnikar. Despite the limitations that we have, Professor Sara Dolnikar will be joining us virtually. Just a brief introduction about Professor. Professor Sara Dolnikar is a professor of tourism at the University of Queensland and an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. She develops and experimentally tests practical measures that trigger pro-environmental consumer behavior in enjoyment-focused contexts, such as tourism and hospitality. She has published more than 300 papers and won more than 30 awards for her works, including being named Slovenian Ambassador of Science in 2016, the highest honor of Republic of Slovenia bestowed on expatriate Slovenian researchers in recognition of global excellence, impact, and knowledge transfer. Sara is the co-editor-in-chief of Annals of Tourism Research. Let us now have the pleasure to listen to the keynote address by Professor Sara Dolnikar.
All right, can you see me and hear me? Can someone give me a thumbs up? Yes, thank you very much. One thumbs up there. So let's go. I've been asked to talk to you today about conducting impactful tourism research. And that's something I feel very strongly about, as you will see soon through this presentation. Let's move straight on. Wait a minute, why is this not working? I knew there was going to be problems. What's happened now? All right, let's try this again. All right, okay, let's hope this works. I would like to share my thoughts about the current research context, which you're all too familiar with, but I will just reiterate a few things, how the higher education context is under pressure generally, how we as researchers find ourselves under massive pressure, and what that means for knowledge development. I want to then talk about habits of knowledge creation. So we've kind of developed habits, and not all of them are very good in terms of how impactful our research is. We tend to rely on one-off cross-sectional survey studies. We tend to rely on self-report measures, and we tend to like to overcomplicate data to impress editors and readers. And then finally, I'd like to briefly talk about how we could move towards valid and powerful future tourism research. And I'll talk about three simple principles how we can achieve that, as well as give you a few examples. So the current research context. Higher education is under pressure. I don't need to tell you this. Continuously, we are assessed for performance all the time, every day of our lives. So for universities want things like Nobel Prize winners. It's really true. I talked to a university vice chancellor recently, and they said to me, oh, we need Nobel Prize winners. We urgently need Nobel Prize winners to improve our ranking. That's crazy, isn't it? Because it's all should be about knowledge creation, not Nobel Prize winners. How many highly cited researchers we have? How many, how we're doing in national rankings and world rankings, like this one you see over here. So the survival and the ability of universities to attract funding is pretty much driven by demonstrable performance, by key performance indicators. So what does that mean for us as researchers? We are increasingly under pressure. We are also continuously assessed for performance. And how are we assessed? Well, the first indicator nowadays is the age index. So if you Google my name, you're going to find that, and it's going to be a very poor representation of myself, I would like to think. I do not like to be judged by my age index. I would much rather that you read a paper of mine and think that was a really brilliant idea. But that's how we are judged. By age indexes, by numbers of papers published, numbers of papers in top journals, numbers of grants won, number of awards won. So our career prospects, whether we like it or not, depend also on demonstrable performance and key performance indicators. Now, what does that mean for knowledge development? We've developed a publish or perish mindset. We are tempted, we don't always give into it, but we are tempted to produce quick and dirty articles. What do I mean by that? Just good enough to be published. Not brilliant, not stellar, just good enough to be published. Not excellence, not impactful, not creating real change for the world. Now that's bad. It's bad for knowledge development as a whole. It's bad for our reputations as scientists and scholars. And it's also bad for our careers, right? Because when we go for our next job interview, all these weak papers, no matter how many of them there are not really going to get us where we want to get. We're never going to be legends because we wrote many, many weak papers. So what habits have we fallen into in our academic knowledge creation as a consequence of this publish and perish culture? We rely heavily on one-off cross-sectional survey studies. So to explain to you what the problem is with this, I want to talk to you about Rossiter's framework of different forms of knowledge that we can create as researchers. First order knowledge we also refer to as concepts. And concepts is where we individually look at certain things. For example, Airbnb comes newly on the market. It's a new concept, so we need to grasp it. We need to understand what is it, and the way we can grasp that is by describing it, by thinking about it, by analyzing it. Then we have second order knowledge, and second order knowledge is about associations. So associations means we have different concepts, and we're now trying to link, we're trying to find connections between these concepts. So what are we interested is to ask, what is it associated with? What is it correlated with? This is where our one-off cross-sectional survey studies come in. So for example, a classic study in tourism is we're studying guest satisfaction, loyalty, and behavioral intention. We study them in the same survey, and then we correlate the three. And then what do? Well, we like to conclude that guest satisfaction drives behavioral intention. But that's not necessarily the case, right? Because they were all measured at the same time. So it may as well be that actually my intention to come to the same hotel again is driving my assessment of it in terms of guest satisfaction. So what we cannot do here is we cannot draw causal conclusions. That's why we need third order knowledge or principles. So this is the structure of how we would try to learn something about principles. And you can see we have a starting point, we have an end point that we would like to achieve, and then we have something in the middle that we can add or remove, or add or remove. And because we are able to add and remove it, we are actually able to figure out if this middle thing is causing a difference in the second state. So here is where experiments come in. And you're going to think to yourself, why is she talking about experiments in tourism? We're not chemists. But I will give you a few examples of how we can do experiments in tourism. Now, if we look at the distribution of our knowledge development, this is what it looks like. About 6% is concepts, about 7% is principles. The vast, vast majority is in associations. And that's concerning, right? Because we've learned that when we associate, we don't really know what's causing what. And if we don't really know what's causing what, then we can't go to a manager or to the UNWTO or to a destination and say, you've got to change this in order to be able to achieve whatever you want to achieve. So we want to push down. We want to move from association studies more in the direction of principles. All right, now let's have a look at why we have problems with our self-report measures in the survey studies. And there's a few reasons I'd like to discuss with you here. One is people do not do what they say they do. So whenever we survey people, we assume that they can accurately report what they're doing. That's certainly not the case. I'll just give you one little example. That's the PhD study of one of my students, Logie Carlson. He went and studied boat tourists. And before they purchased, well, just after they purchased tickets for one of two boat tours, he asked them, did they consider the environment? And guess what? 60% did. Now, one of the boats was eco-certified, the other one was not, right? And 60% tell us that they're considering the environment when they book the tour. But then once they're trapped on the boat and the boat tour starts, we ask them one extra question. We say, is the boat on which you're standing now eco-certified or not? Logically, we would expect 60% of people to say the right answer. Well, that's unfortunately not the case. We're down to 14. So that's really important to remember. People are going to tell us all sorts of things in surveys, and they will not necessarily be able to tell us how they behave or how they behaved in the past. People's responses are not stable. That's quite a shocking insight. So I'll show you a little chart here, and I want you to look at the black bars only. So here what we've done is we asked people questions, and we did it twice in a row with 2 weeks in between. And then we measured how often they gave us the same response. Now, nothing changed in those 2 weeks, right? So it wasn't about some political matter where there were massive changes, not at all. 2 repeat measurements of destination image, 2 weeks apart, and we used different answer options for people, right? And you're all familiar with the 5 points and 7 points so-called Likert scale, which is not my favorite. But that's not important here. What's important is that we look at people giving us the same response. And you can see if you use any kind of 7-point scale, people are only going, less than half of the people will give you the same response twice. When you go to a 5-point scale, it's about 60%. When you go to a forced choice full binary, that's when people say yes or no, it's up to 82%. So a few important things. It's never 100%, right? It's not like in the sciences where we measure temperature. There's always some kind of error. But you can see that we are taking the numbers in our data sets for granted. We assume they are a given and they're true and they're stable. And that's not the case. And that undermines the validity of our one-off cross-sectional survey studies. We misinterpret midpoints. So here we did a little survey study again. We measured twice in a row. The first time we gave respondents a don't know option. The second time we removed the don't know option. And what you see here is just the plot of where the don't knows landed. And you can see when it's a 2-point scale, the don't knows went half-half, and so on and so on. When we're at the 7-point scale, all the don't knows sit in the midpoint. Again, for the validity of our research, that's a problem, right? Because we interpret the midpoint as an actual meaningful value. But what we learned from this study is that it's all muddled up. It's a bit of don't know, it's a bit of midpoint, it's a bit of can't be bothered, it's a bit of I've never thought about this before. So again, undermining validity. People interact with response options. So let's say we have a classic 5-point scale. Me, I'm from Slovenia. I will always tend to tick a 1 or a 5, right? Because in my culture, I feel obliged to be honest. So I'm going to tell you it's a 1 or a 5. My colleagues from Asia will operate quite differently. They will be much more modest. They will say it's not modest to go to the end. So they will sit in the middle. But that doesn't mean that we are not actually equally satisfied about a holiday, right? It just means that we are interacting. We and our cultural backgrounds interact with answer formats in surveys. Again, undermining. And there's other issues with scales, like with 5-point scales. We tend to assume that it's the same distance, but that's not the case. The distances between scale points are actually quite different. People get tired easily. So what the biggest problem market research companies face is that researchers want to field massively long surveys. Now that's a problem because people get tired and they give very low quality responses towards the end of the survey. So here I'll just ask you for the sake of time, I will ask you to look at the far right chart where it says clear potential. And what you see there is that originally we had 22 items, and we were able to actually extract almost all the information from 5 items. So all we needed to ask was 5 survey questions instead of 25. So you can imagine those extra questions were just tiring out respondents and undermining the validity of our research. And if you're still not convinced about concerns relating to survey research, especially one-off cross-sectional surveys, is that people actually don't read what you're asking them. So here there's a little illustration from one of our eye tracking studies. So what you can see here is actually the question people were asked in the survey. And the little yellow dots is where the person's eye looked. And this is a perfect respondent because you can see the eye looks and reads all the instructions. Then it looks at the stimulus, so the thing we're trying to test. And then at the bottom, this particular yellow respondent here looks at all the answer options carefully, then goes to say next, decides to go back, reassess again, and finally moves on. So this responded required 92 seconds and clearly did a very good job. Now we have a red respondent where that's not the case, right? So totally ignored the scenario, totally actually ignored what we were asking them to do. Then had a look of a stimulus, particularly at the good-looking lady there on the right. Then skimmed down to answering questions, and you can see they didn't actually look at the answer options very carefully, and then went on to answer. Beautiful, completed the task very efficiently in 30 seconds. Now, when you're analyzing the data, you could have all red respondents. You just never know, all right? And we will take this data for valid when really it is not. So huge problems with survey data that we are not acknowledging enough, and that can only be partially overcome. There are solutions for most of these issues, but they are never 100% solutions. And then we have data analysis. And as a journal editor, I can tell you one thing. I think there is some myth out there where people think the more complicated the analysis, the better. Well, I can tell you for certain that for annals of tourism research, that's not the case. We certainly are not obsessed with complicated analysis. We would like to see the simplest possible analysis that will answer validly your research question. All right, now let's have a look at the consequences of our poor research habits. We will have a lack of validity. What does that mean? That it actually means that our conclusions do not hold. And that's a real problem, right? Because if we want to publish something, we need to know that the conclusions hold. If we want to make recommendations to policymakers, governments, businesses, we need to be certain that our conclusions are valid. Another consequence is lack of reliability. So if we were to do the same study again, would we get the same results or would we get totally different results? If we get totally different results, again, you can see that's quite a significant problem. So our poor research habits are bad for knowledge development. They're bad for our reputation as scientists and scholars. And they're also bad for our careers, right? Because these kind of research studies don't make us legends, right? They might help us with the publish and perish culture, but they don't really show the best in us as researchers. How could we move towards more valid and impactful future research? So there's three key features I would like to propose. You might want to think about when you conduct research studies. Certainly there are 3 points I consider every time I do undertake my own research. One is wherever I possibly can, I measure real behavior and I try not to rely on what people tell me. Now, of course, it's complicated and of course it's easier to just put a survey online, but it is well worth it. It is really a lot more rewarding when you can prove something with real behavior than when you can prove it just by what people tell you. You want to really try to create third-order knowledge. You want to be able to draw causal conclusions and not rely solely on associations. Why? Because then you can go to a manager and you can say, if this is what you want to achieve and this is where you stand now, I can guarantee you that doing this will achieve your aim. Yeah? And please do use the simple possible correct data analysis because really it's not a matter of impressing people. It's just about data analysis is not the purpose in its own right. It's just the tool to answer your research question. All right, and now we're going to move to a few examples. And the reason I'm showing you examples is because I want to show you that it's really not complicated, right? We can do very simple studies that are impactful, that are valid, and that are reliable by following those principles. So here's one example. Some of them are my work, some of them are other people's work. This one's one of our studies, and what we tried to do is we tried to get tourists to waive their room clean. Why did we want to do that? Because room cleans are very expensive for hotels, but they're also very environmentally unfriendly. So in this particular hotel, Bochin Eco Hotel, the base rate of people putting the sign out and saying, no need to clean my room is 3%. So it's almost nothing, right? What we did is we said, we talked to them, we offered them a free drink, but we didn't just give them a drink. We said to them, listen, if you're gonna waive the room clean, that will save us quite a bit of money. And we are willing to go halves. So we will just save half of the money and we'll give you half of the money back. So we made them an offer of sharing the savings. And then we refunded the money in form of a drinks voucher. This simple intervention reduced room cleaning by 42%. And importantly, the guests were just as happy, no drop in guest satisfaction whatsoever. Just out of curiosity, we then also added an environmental appeal. So we did the same thing, but we also said it's actually hugely beneficial to the environment if you wave the room clean. And guess what? Absolutely no change as a consequence of that environmental appeal. That's interesting, right? Because that's really what we're currently doing all the time in tourism. We're appealing at people's environmental responsibility. And this specific experiment shows that that's not necessarily a very promising strategy. So we can make tourists wave room cleans by sharing and not preaching. And you can see we're measuring real behavior. We have an experimental design, and the data analysis is very simple. It's just basically a regression analysis. We can do this even better by just changing the default. So what we can do is, instead of saying to people, we will clean your room, but if you don't want it cleaned, put the sign out. We say to them, we're not going to clean your room, but if you want it cleaned, put the sign out. And there's no surcharge, right? So there's no implications in terms of payment or money or price. And this little change in default reduces room cleaning by 63%. You can imagine what a cost saving that is for the hotel and what an environmental benefit that is. And absolutely no difference in guest satisfaction. Why? Because they were still in control. They told us what they wanted, whether they wanted their room cleaned or not. Great study from a team from Switzerland. They reduced shower time in hotels by providing instant feedback to people. So as the people were showering, they could see on a little screen how many liters were flowing through. And that little intervention reduced energy cost. In this case, they were not measuring water use, but electricity to warm the water, reduced energy cost by 11% with no impact on guest satisfaction. One of my all-time favorite studies is that you can reduce plate waste by reducing plate size. Again, huge cost implications and huge environmental implications because uneaten food, so people go to the buffet, they overfill their plates, and then they leave a third behind. And that's super environmentally unfriendly because we waste all the resources for producing the food. And then when that waste goes into landfill, it produces methane, which is a super powerful greenhouse gas. So very simple experiment conducted by colleagues, economics experts across 52 hotels. And what they did is they reduced by 3 centimeters the plates at the buffet, and they managed to reduce the plate waste by 20%. Very, very happy customers. They couldn't care less how big the plate size was. Why? Because they could go back again, right? We never limited, the researchers never limited the amount of food they were allowed to take or eat. Same group of researchers had even a cheaper approach. They used table signs that had exactly that wording. Welcome back again and again, visit our buffet many times. That's better than taking a lot at once. Here they were appealing at social norms. So they were trying to explain to people that it's actually not embarrassing to go back. It's much more embarrassing to overfill your plate and be greedy in that one run. Beautiful effect, 21% reduction in plate waste, no negative impact on guest satisfaction. And we were inspired by this work, so we did something targeting specifically families. Again, very simple intervention, very simple data analysis and behavior as the dependent variable. We gave children stamp collection books, and this is literally what it looked like. So you can see, not very sophisticated at all, doesn't have to be an app. It's just a one A4 piece of paper. For every time the whole family ate everything up at dinner, they get a stamp. And at the end of the stay, if they have a stamp for every day, they get a little prize. 38% reduction in plate waste and associated cost for the hotel. Very, very happy families. I can assure you that, especially very happy children. All right, now away from the tourists onto the staff. A lovely study, one of the first studies published in our new journal, Annals of Tourism Research Empirical Insights. Beautiful experiment. They found out huge food waste in the kitchen. So all they did is they took the big intransparent food bins away and they replaced them with smaller transparent bins. And just that little change in the kitchen reduced plate waste by 73%. Why? Well, there were two reasons. The cooks were too lazy to empty their little bin all the time. So they would just be more careful how much they threw away. And the fact that the bin was transparent meant that they could see if something was wasted that actually shouldn't have been wasted, and they became more careful. So beautiful little experiment, behavioral variables, simple data analysis, great impact. Every hotel should immediately do that based on this research. Now, away from the classic experimental studies, this here is an eye tracking study that is a choice experiment, so a little bit more sophisticated in terms of data analysis. But again, we're looking at behavior. We're looking at the behavior of people's eyes as they choose which hotel to select. Another one here, my colleague Gabby Walters here is UQ. She is into psychophysiological measurements, and that's a very exciting area. So she wired up people with electrodes in the face that allows us to measure how their facial muscles move. And then she tested how people's emotions, as measured by their facial muscles, in response to advertisements. So again, real behavior, quite a different kind of behavior, muscle movement. But that reflects people's reaction to ads. So very interesting research here with immediate implications. One of my all-time favorite studies is Noam Shoval's work using GPS trackers. So what you can see here is how a person moves around Jerusalem, and they are fitted with a GPS tracking device. And the device also measures their skin conductance. Skin conductance is just a little bit of sweat on your skin that tells you about how activated a person is. So you can see as you trace them through Jerusalem, you can see that the really impressive sides just get tourists really excited. And then on top of that, he went and he, sometimes where you see the towers, he pushed a little survey question via a telephone to them. So absolutely amazing things you can do here, because you can now track them, understand how they're activated, and you can intervene with a little push notification on their mobile. Perfect setup for experimental research. And the last one I want to mention before I wrap this up is because everything I've done was quantitative, quantitative, quantitative. And I just wanted to make absolutely sure that there's no misunderstanding. Quantitative research cannot live without qualitative research, right? Qualitative research is about in-depth understanding. And then quantitative research is about testing hypotheses. So very different purposes. And here's one of the studies I've enjoyed being part of. It was my PhD student, Emil Ljuban. And he fought with me for a long time. He said, oh, sustainable tourism doesn't work. Nobody behaves sustainably. And I said, well, that's not true. So we were arguing. And in the end, we came up with this design where we said, let's talk to those people we would most expect to behave sustainably. And that's people who volunteer their time for environmental causes. So Emil went and interviewed them, and sure enough, they all were quite aware of the environmental implications of tourism, but instead of behaving in more sustainable ways, like taking the train to the destination, they found a whole array of excuses, justifications of why it was okay during the vacation to not be quite as sustainable. Now that then leads to kind of a conceptual framework which lends itself for experimentation studies down the track. All right, well, I think that's all. Oh no, my little summary, sorry. Most importantly, my little pep talk. Whatever research you do, you've got to find a topic you're genuinely passionate about, all right? So for us at the moment, it's low harm hedonism. So we are determined to make consumers behave more environmentally friendly without detracting from the enjoyment of the consumer experience. So you've got to be passionate. You can never compromise on quality. You never compromise on the rigor of your research design. And you need to know your main currency is great new ideas. So if we as editors see a fantastic new idea, that's when we get very excited about your paper too. And that's probably the key ingredients for good, impactful research. That's it from me. I'm not sure if the format allows questions, but if so, I would be most happy to take some.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful address. I hope we as researchers will be able to use your input on knowledge development, knowledge creation, experimental studies in tourism, and how to conduct valid research.